This is the Reading with Rachelle podcast, where we will explore history we never learned in school but wish we had. I'm Rachelle Chase, an author and a columnist, and this week's book is The Black Angels, the untold story of the nurses who helped cure tuberculosis by Maria Smilios. In the 1920s, due to Jim Crow and forced segregation, Black nurses could only work at Black hospitals. Shockingly, there were only 210 registered Black hospitals compared to 6,807 white hospitals in the U.S. at this time. Despite a shortage of nursing staff, white hospitals refused to hire Black nurses. But in 1929, white nurses began quitting at Seaview Hospital on Staten Island. The main reason for the mass exodus was because Seaview's only patients, 1,800 of New York's poorest people, had tuberculosis. Black nurses recruited from the South took the white nurses' places. Who were these nurses that risked their lives for 20 years? What was life like for them? How did they help cure tuberculosis? These are just a few of the questions that author Maria Smilios answers on this week's episode. A little bit about Maria. Maria Smilios is an award-winning author, keynote speaker, and adjunct lecturer at Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health. Her book, The Black Angels, won the 2024 Christopher Award in Literature, which celebrates works that affirm the highest values of the human spirit. It was also a finalist for the prestigious Gotham Book Prize, an NASW Science and Society Journalism finalist, an NPR Science Friday Summer Read for 2024, and shortlisted for the English PEN Literary Award. All right, Maria, welcome to Reading with Rachelle. I am so happy to have you here today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Well, as I told you, my book club read The Black Angels, the Untold Story of the Nurses Who Helped Cure Tuberculosis, and we really liked it. So I was like, well, I have to have you on. I have to talk to you about this book.
Awesome. I love it when book clubs read my book and they like it.
Yeah, we did. Well, first of all, I realized I did not know what tuberculosis was. And when you said consumption, I was like, oh my gosh, I heard that like in a lot of like historical books, had no idea that's what it was. So can you just explain what tuberculosis is, first of all?
So that's a great question, because when I was writing the book, people kept saying to me, why are you writing about a disease that doesn't exist? When in fact, it's the number one global infectious disease killer in the world. It's also the only disease where we could say it has a cure, and it's the number one global infectious disease killer in the world. So tuberculosis has most commonly been known as consumption because it's a disease that literally consumes you from the inside out. It is an airborne, on the most basic level, it's an airborne bacteria, and it loves the lungs, although it affects many other organs. People who have read the book have said to me, I didn't know that it could affect the brain or the kidneys or the tongue even. It can, but it thrives in places where there's oxygen. That's how the bacteria lives, which is why it likes to situate itself in the lungs, where, as I mentioned, it burrows itself and it feeds off of this warm, oxygenated, rich blood, and it burrows. So the microbe, as I say, is one of the most beautifully rendered microbes in human history. It is designed to torture and kill. It's wrapped in several layers of fat, which makes it impenetrable to antibiotics and disinfectants, so it could live for a long time. Once it enters the body, it also is one of the most deadly because it replicates extremely slowly. So, for example, E. coli replicates itself every 20 minutes, which is why within 24 hours or even sooner, you're sick from E. coli. Tuberculosis replicates itself once every 24 hours. So it takes months for the disease to actually for the person to begin to show symptoms. I think of it like a long Pac-Man, where it chomps away at your muscles, your tendons, your organs, and it creates these giant holes called cavities. So, for example, in the lungs, If you think of a piece of Swiss cheese, that's what a lung with tuberculosis looks like, where the edges of it, except Swiss cheese, like you don't have the frayed edges from the muscles and the tissues that it's eaten away at. In the organs, in children, tuberculosis loved the spine. So it gnawed away at the bone until the bones, the spine, the vertebrae collapsed on each other. So yeah, it's a pretty, for a tiny, it's a very, very tiny. If it's the period at the end of a sentence can fit like 400 or 500 like TB bacteria,
Wow.
microns.
Wow.
So it's pretty intense. It's a pretty intense bacteria.
Yeah. Well, and I didn't realize you paint this picture from the beginning of New York, and it seems like it's in the midst of this like TB epidemic. And you open this book with this vivid image of the tenements and the numbers that you were throwing out there too, like 80,000 5-story tenement buildings and 2 million that house 2 million people and 2/3 of the population of New York. And there's rats and pigs. And I mean, it was just, you painted this picture, and you do that a lot throughout the book of what it really looks like. And it seemed like, because it has no cure, it seems like the New York Department of Health was issuing some, I guess it was the registration law. Can you tell me or the listeners what was that and the significance to tuberculosis?
Yeah. So the registration law was started by a man named Dr. Herman Biggs, who was the person in charge of, it wasn't called the Department of Health then. He was in charge of the city's, what was the dawning of public health in New York. So let's just say the Department of Public Health, for lack of a better term at the moment. And he was this militant guy who was determined. He had these lofty aspirations, as I explain in the book, to eradicate tuberculosis in a single generation. His ideas were good. They were executed wrong, right? He was bigoted. He blamed tuberculosis so yes, in the Lower East Side, there were 80,000 5-story tenement buildings collectively housing 2/3 of New York's population, which was over 2 million people. So all these people were smashed in these apartments. They lived on top of each other. There was scant fresh air. There was no indoor plumbing. Basically, they were living in conditions that were absolutely perfect for tuberculosis to thrive. Herman Biggs blamed most of these people were immigrants that came over to America looking for a better life. And they were down on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Now you had Midtown Manhattan, and on the top you had Harlem. And the other population that was deeply affected were the African Americans in Harlem. So Biggs hated the African Americans, and he hated the immigrants, and he hated the tenements. And so his thing was, I am going to control tuberculosis, and the only way I could do it is by starting this registration law. So he pulled this idea from a guy named John Snow, he was a British doctor who had discovered the spread of cholera in England came from a well. And he did this by mapping out. It's kind of like, remember when they were saying COVID, we could see how much COVID there is by the wastewater? That's a similar thing. So what he did was he sent doctors and nurses into the tenements, and they started knocking on doors, and they were to report back to him every single person and address and apartment that had somebody who was suffering from tuberculosis. And on the back of his wall, on the wall in his office, he had a map of New York City. And every time they came in and reported it, he would take a black pen and make a dot. And soon this pattern began to emerge. And he saw that this constellation of tuberculosis was really, really centered in the Lower East Side and in Harlem. And so he said, we need to get rid of these people who are putting at jeopardy the rest of the city. He called them, quote, immoral, uncouth consumptives. And so this is how Seaview Hospital came into, the idea of Seaview was birthed through this registration law. But I should say the doctors and nurses back then didn't like the registration law. They said it compromised the integrity of their patients. And there was nothing like HIPAA back then. So that just gives you an indication of like that the doctors had some wherewithal. And they also believed that It's kind of like today. You have undocumented people who are afraid of the government knowing that they might be sick. So the doctors were saying, you're also scaring people away from saying they have somebody who's sick. So that was the registration law.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of led into the next question. So that's how Seaview Hospital then comes. And I didn't realize that these islands, they were using them for these types of reasons. And Seaview was one of them. So this was this 1929? What time period was this?
No, so Herman Biggs, the registration law and the idea for Seaview was birthed in 1903. And then it was built in 1913. And then up till about 1929, things were going, I say, quote, okay. There was a lot of corruption at the hospital, but things were kind of status quo. They had managed to lower the annual death rate. They cut it in half from 10,000 dying a year annually just in New York City, the five boroughs, to 5,000. And there it stalled, and they were okay with that, except then the white nurses began leaving.
Right.
And suddenly they were not okay with it.
And that was 1929, when the white nurses now are beginning to leave at Seaview. Okay. So now we have, finally, for you, Black nurses at this time could not really work they didn't have a lot of options where they could work. And so now Black nurses are going to be recruited to work at Seaview. You had some interesting statistics about Black nurses as well, where you said in the 20s that there were 210 Black hospitals compared to 6,807 white hospitals. And Black nurses could only work in those. But those numbers, I stopped to think, I'm like, wait a minute, this is like for the whole country. There's 210 hospitals that Black people can go to, not only that nurses can work at. So that was first mind-boggling. But then the fact that it took tuberculosis for now these Black nurses to be able to work at the hospital, this was very surprising to me. And it was considered a kind of a good job for them because they couldn't work anywhere else, right?
Yeah, I mean, it gave them the opportunity to have a professional career. And in their mind, if they were able to have a professional career, they could buy a home and become part of the American middle class and be seen as equal, which was a kind of pipe dream, because that's not what happened. It didn't matter how many houses they owned. It didn't matter how much property they owned. They would never be seen as equal in the United States, at least in the 30s and 40s. So the numbers with the hospitals are staggering because the white hospitals were grossly understaffed, and the people running them preferred to keep them understaffed rather than hire Black nurses. Most of them hired one or two, and the women who were hired were emotionally, mentally, and sometimes even physically abused by their colleagues and their supervisors.
What was it like for the nurses at Seaview?
So when the nurses came up, well, first of all, the interesting thing is they thought they were coming to Harlem. They didn't know where Staten Island was. It wasn't like you could Google something and here's Staten Island. Staten Island, for those who are not familiar with the way the city is laid out, was completely disconnected from the four boroughs. Now it's connected with the Verrazano Bridge, which runs through Brooklyn. So there's a bridge that goes from Brooklyn to Staten Island. That only happened in 1964. Before then, the only way you could get to Staten Island was ferry. And it's still the only way you can get from Manhattan to Staten Island, because if you don't drive, there's no train that goes there. It's just the ferry. And it's 5 miles from Manhattan, but it may as well have been in a different world, a different country. Staten Island had a couple of 100,000 people living there. It was bucolic. It was agrarian. There was goats and chickens and sheep kind of roaming freely the island. It was picture perfect. It had lakes, and it has a greenway, which is considered one of the most extraordinary greenways in the country, right? And so they get this idea to build this hospital way up on a hilltop, 400 feet above sea level, completely isolated, right? And it's very cold up there. So they're getting these winds coming up from the North Atlantic because part of it faces the Verrazano Narrows where the bridge is built. That area opens up into the North Atlantic Ocean. So ships coming in enter New York Bay, and then you see the Statue of Liberty. Ships going out go right into the Atlantic Ocean, and then you can go wherever you want. So it's very cold up there. It's very isolated. And these nurses find themselves, most of them start living in Harlem, and they have this 5 to 6 hour round trip commute. So that's the first shocking thing that happens. And then they get to Seaview, and it's one of four of the 29 municipal hospitals, only 4 allowed Black nurses to work. Seaview was one of them. So that was part of the package, this idea that you will work in one of New York City's integrated hospitals. The patient population was also integrated, and it was divided men and women. And then they built a children's hospital in 1937. Prior to that, the children they had the top floor of one of the pavilions, and it had a maternity ward as well, one of the few hospitals that had an obstetrics ward. And as a matter of fact, when the book came out, this woman wrote to me and she said, I was born in Seaview and my mother died a year after I was born. So, but the nurses went to work there under this woman named Miss Lorna Doone Mitchell. Miss Mitchell was hired in 1929 from Willard Parker Hospital, which was one of the premier infectious disease hospitals in the country. It was in New York, to retrain and retain this new staff of Black nurses. She was, but in the book, she is a nuanced figure. She was the daughter of a Confederate medic raised in a rural Virginia town. And she wielded her power again in ways that was abusive to the Black nurses. She stalked them in the hallways. She refused to let them wear masks. She didn't let them transfer. Now, one of the nurses said to me, it wasn't that easy. The reason she might not let us transfer is because we were trained so well and nobody wanted this job that she wanted to keep us. And that's why I say she is a nuanced figure. She was the second in command. She was a woman holding a very high position with a lot of men above her. Now, did she wield her power in perverse ways? Absolutely. Was she a product of her time? Absolutely. When I interviewed Miss Virginia Allen, who's one of the last living Black angels, she said, Miss Mitchell was a racist, but Miss Mitchell trained us to be excellent nurses. And so as a journalist, I needed to put that in the book because that's what I was being told, not just by Miss Virginia Allen, but by other family members. But she was notoriously horrible overall. She was not a nice person. She was a nasty woman for the most part.
Yeah, you definitely show that. I mean, you do show the nuances with her personality, but you definitely show what these nurses are going through, like their day to day is like. And then they're on the island where people don't really want them there either. It's like, so they're going through a lot of this.
Yeah, I mean, Staten Islanders did not want the Black nurses there. As I say, they saw them as contagion. Their skin, they believed they were contagious from the disease itself. As one nurse said, they looked at us and they thought the disease was going to jump off our skin. And then they looked at these Black women also as being a contagion on their island. The nurses also represented an infectious disease hospital, and they had in the 1850s a quarantine station that they had burned down. They didn't want infectious disease hospitals on their island. So that was a big problem as well.
I want to go back to something you said about Miss Mitchell and her not letting them wear masks. You had mentioned a name of a physician or a scientist who I'd heard about before, Dr. Samuel Cartwright. And you'd mentioned that I didn't know he was the one that invented the drapetomania, the runaway slave syndrome, as if that's a disorder, the fact that Black people want to run away and escape. But then you mentioned something interesting, all these other scientific things, and some of them seem to be believed in some ways today about Black people in terms of them having smaller brains, more sensitive skin, overdeveloped nervous systems. But then you said he thought that they were resistant to tuberculosis.
Yes.
But then Dr. Ornstein now comes and says, so could you tell me a little bit about how he then took what Cartwright said and now is kind of doing some things with that at Seaview?
Absolutely. So Cartwright believed that, I can't remember I don't have the book in front of me to do the exact quote, but he said something like consumption was a disease of the sanguine. I think basically it was a white man's disease.
Right.
And that Black people did not get tuberculosis. So Dr. Ornstein was the medical director of Seaview Hospital, and he decided to take this idea and to kind of test it out. And it was a double, what he was doing was not just like testing Cartwright's idea out, but he was testing out the idea of whether, so let me rewind a second. In the early 1930s, the idea of wearing masks to combat infectious disease was just emerging. And so this J. Arthur Myers had written an article, he was a doctor, that said nurses that work in tuberculosis wards are at higher risk of getting sick. Maybe they should be wearing masks. So Ornstein he had this proliferation of Black nurses at Seaview. So he decided he was going to do this 4-year study and follow these nurses to see if there was something about their constitution that made them resistant to tuberculosis, or if they tested positive and had latent TB. And it was kind of inconclusive, the study, after 4 years. The nurses did test positive for tuberculosis, but not many got sick. So his results, I don't want to misquote him because I don't have it in front of me, and I don't remember it off the top of my head. But I think it was basically like, this is an inconclusive thing. We see that they are susceptible to it. Maybe masks would work. Maybe they wouldn't. And is it a disease only of the white man? No. But can he definitely say that the constitution of Black people has anything to do with them getting it or not getting it? No. So what he found out was that within 6 months, most people tested positive for tuberculosis, most of the nurses. That was basically the gist of this study.
Well, of course, I was just like, really? We needed to study that? I mean, I'm like,
I mean,
wow. Mm-hmm.
You think of like the kind of stuff when I was researching the book and I came across that with Cartwright, I literally just kept reading it and rereading it. And it was really, at one part, I mean, on the one hand, it was appalling. And on the other hand, you're like, well, that was the way people thought. And it was so horrible and so harrowing that you kind of like, you don't know how to process it when you're reading it. And then he goes in 1934, Ornstein, he starts this study in 1934 to either prove or disprove it. So on his nurses,
right?
That's the other thing.
Exactly. Wow. So speaking of doing things to people, you go into detail these treatments that are going on to treat tuberculosis that seem pretty barbaric. Of course, I was a pre-med major, so I was really kind of like, oh my goodness, this one and this one. So maybe people will be as fascinated by this that are listening as I am. But can you go over some of these treatments that they were doing, these surgical treatments, and what were the nurses? What was their involvement in this? How were they assisting?
So yeah, this is a great question because I did not study medicine, but I can tell you exactly what happens in a thoracoplasty, which is the removal of 9 ribs in two or three separate operations. I'll start off with the lesser procedure, which was the artificial pneumothorax. A pneumothorax is a collapse of the lung. An artificial pneumothorax is a purposely collapsed lung. So the idea was, because tuberculosis thrives in the lungs, in oxygen, if you collapse the lung, you deflate it, basically. The bacteria doesn't have anything to feed off of it, and so it dies off. That was the thought behind this idea. And so this Italian doctor creates this machine where you stick a needle in between a rib and you collapse the lung. You fill it, you poke the lung, you go through you go through the rib into the chest cavity, you collapse the lung, you fill a person with air to keep the lung collapsed, and you give the lung time to rest. Now, what happened was, when I read about this, people were, quote, refilled. Some of them were refilled with air over 100 times because between it only lasted 8 to 10 days. It was extremely uncomfortable. The people would walk around and Patients said that you could hear the air like coming out of a balloon leaking. Another thing was they would open the chest cavity and pack it with like ping pong balls or wax packs to keep the lung collapsed. Those were now the artificial pneumothorax, people would walk in and out. They would do it within like 5 minutes. It was like filling a balloon, and they were able to do 30, 40 a day. Like it was a kind of factory. The operation that was one of the more harrowing ones was the thoracoplasty, which is the removal of part of the lung. And so what they would do is they would cut you open this gigantic incision, move from your neck around your shoulder blade down to the front of your rib cage, and they would begin removing ribs. And as the description that Dr. Robacek, the doctor who oversaw the trial, said, he wrote this piece on Seaview, and he said, I just remember ribs being removed in bushels of 6 to 8 at a time. And for that was a really dangerous operation, actually, especially in the early 1930s when anesthesia. It's funny because the other day I was reading that thing that one of the drug companies, Anthem, is going to stop covering anesthesia.
Oh my gosh.
Have you heard this? So I thought I was like hallucinating when I read it. So it said one of the drug companies is going to stop covering anesthesia at a certain point. So if you have an operation and they say the tonsillectomy is going to take 2 hours and it takes 2.5, the half hour they're not going to cover anymore.
Oh my gosh.
And I said to my friend, what are they going to do? Wake somebody up or just let them wake up while they're under the knife like they did in the 1930s? That was one of the problems. Anesthesia, it was the dawning of anesthesia. They didn't know. And a lot of the times patients would wake up mid-surgery.
Wow.
Especially with long operations like the thoracoplasty. So those were really harrowing operations.
Yeah.
You're talking about no antibiotic. That's the thing. Not a single antibiotic. And the risk even nowadays for a surgery that is that long and that complicated to get infection is high. Imagine back then with not a single antibiotic, they didn't have private recovery rooms. There weren't ICUs. It was nothing like that. Seaview was an open ward. And the post-op rooms were also, there were 3 and 4 beds within the room, no matter if you had a minor surgery or a major surgery like that.
Well, and you were talking about Edna, one of the Black nurses. I think she was taking care of Elka. I don't know, Elke, I don't know how to pronounce her name.
Elke.
And I was shocked there. You said she couldn't have any painkillers after her surgery. And she's just gone through this thoroplasty. Is that how you pronounced it?
Thoracoplasty, yeah.
She's just gone through that and has no painkillers. I was like, wow, it was amazing. So what were the Black nurses? What were their roles? Were they assisting in these surgeries? Were they?
Yeah.
They were, right? And they were then helping the patients.
Yeah, they were like, Edna was the doctor's right-hand person. It's very similar to the role of operating room nurses today. I mean, the thing is, what people tend to disregard about nursing, and I learned this. I'm not a nurse, but having been around nurses for so many years and doing such a deep dive, is they are the backbone of a hospital. A hospital can't run without nurses. That operating room is prepped. Those patients, pre-op is all nursing. The operating room is set up by nurses. The doctor breezes in, he does his surgery, and he's got his nurses there. It is the nurses keeping that operating room functioning. And especially back in the days of the 1930s, there was a nurse who actually had to count. This was for 2 reasons. They would count the number of these little gauze squares that were used for blood. Every time there was one put in and taken out, there was a nurse who had to have it. And at the end of the surgery, she would count it to make sure all of them had been removed from the body and nothing was forgotten inside, and also to try and measure blood loss. So that's just to give you an indication of the kind of work that these women were doing, which you don't think about when you think about a nurse, especially a nurse who was working in an operating room back in the 1930s. And they were doing, pre-op, operating, and post-op.
And working multiple shifts back to back.
Oh, yeah.
So there's shortage.
Their shifts were like 12 to 14 hours. This was before the day of the 8-hour workday. And even with the 8-hour workday, it was never an 8-hour workday. And the thing I always say is that even if it was, these nurses had no recourse. These were Black women who had few options. And if they spoke up, they could be fired.
And some of them you did go through some situations where the nurses were speaking up for different things. You had like an author's dream where you got a chance to speak to relatives of these nurses at the actual Virginia Allen, one of the Black Angels. You got to speak to the Dr. Robichek's son. How was that from an author's standpoint to be able to really talk to these people and get the stories first and secondhand?
It was amazing. It was an incredible experience. The nurse's story was built all on almost 99% on oral history. There were no archives. There were no journals.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just start with the nurses. Those family members, most of them are still alive. Virginia Allen is still alive. The family members are still alive. And when I first approached them, they were like, what do you mean they just went to work? They didn't really do anything, right? And the story had floated around Staten Island for a long time. But it was a very hallmark sentimentalized story of, oh, these Black nurses were called up, the white nurses quit, and TB was cured. And I was like, nah, that's not really what happened. It was like this really like in-depth, extraordinary story. So I got to know them. The book took me 8 years to write. They text me almost every day, different things, send me pictures. They're all in their like late 70s, early 80s. And it's just this, I feel like I have been blessed that my path crossed with these people who they had a very hard life, a lot of them. They were raised by their aunts. A lot of them these were aunts. Virginia was raised by her aunt. Her mother died when she came up when she was 16. Her mother died, I think, at 20. So her aunt Edna really became her mom, and her aunt Americus, which was Edna's sister, who also worked at Seaview. I spoke to Edna's son. He's still alive. As a matter of fact, when I met him, I said, where was your mom buried? And he said, Frederick Douglass Memorial Cemetery in Staten Island. I said, I'd like to go see her. And he said, you can't. We don't have a headstone. And I said, what do you mean you don't have a headstone? He said, we never could afford one. Now, she died in 1988 and his father died in 1950. And it was like one of the saddest things that I had heard, because I remembered my mom died when I was young, and I remember going to visit her grave before they had put the headstone there. And I thought, this is so sad. Like, there's nothing here marking her existence in this world. Like, people don't know she existed. And 2 weeks ago, we had an unveiling for a headstone for his mom. And he said, when the book came out, people loved it, and somebody did a fundraiser, and she finally got her headstone. So these stories, I felt like, oh my goodness, this at least gave back something. So it was this amazing experience. I mean, it was painful at times too, to listen to them recount these stories of Missourians growing up in the Jim Crow South, or Edna, who was born in a tar paper shack in Savannah, in the poorest area in 1900. Where tens of thousands of Black people lived in these shanty towns. And I tell the story of how the Savannah Directory said that her job at 8 years old was a laundress. She had already been marked to do something at that age. And then Dr. Robichek's son, who also, his wife wrote me, he recently passed away suddenly. That was a gift as well. He was very close to his father. He had these incredible archives, which consisted of the original trial records with the patients' names. And it was from there that I was able to track down the original trial patients who were in the book. So that too was special. I became really close to him as well. He would write me an email and say, oh, I remember this about my dad. That's where I was able to get all these details, because I badgered these people for years. I was like, did your dad like the cold? And he was like, no, my dad hated the cold. He was constantly, and I have that. He was blowing in his hands all the time because it was cold up at Seaview Hospital. Missouri with her mint in her, and that she would tuck it in her mouth, and she wore this copper bracelet. There was a nurse who walked around with garlic because her grandmother told her that it would ward off disease and evil. So all of those little details, I I'm grateful that they were able to remember them. And I think that's because it took a lot of time.
Yeah, you said also, I think in your acknowledgments, you talked about recreating the story of these nurses, that it was painstaking and it was a monumental task. And I could see it because you really take us into the lives of these nurses, not only what they're experiencing in the hospital, but what they're experiencing outside of the hospital when they're not there. Also, what it's like for Black people in New York at that time. There were some things I didn't know. So, yeah, I could see how that could be the case. But what did you mean by that? This is like my perception, all that detail, all of that, that seems very like a monumental task. But what did you mean by that statement?
I think it's a twofold thing. It's one, it is what how you interpreted it. My initial thing, I love fiction. I wanted this book to read like a novel. I did not want it to be for a particular audience. I wanted medical people to pick it up and say she got the science right. And I wanted lay people to pick it up and to be able to understand what tuberculosis was, or any of those medical procedures or terms. I wanted to break it down into your like my dad only had like a high school education. And I remember I had a professor and he said to me, the best thing you could do is just write for an audience like your dad. And I thought if my dad was alive, I'd want him to be able to pick up this book and understand it. I wanted the relatives of the nurses to pick it up and understand all of the science behind it. They understood everything else when it came to like race because they lived it, but I wanted them to understand the science. So that was a monumental undertaking to really break down the effects of a disease and break down like I taught a class at Columbia University this semester, and I told them it was called human centered storytelling. And I explained to them how I broke down this disease and into layman's terms. I literally took a picture of the microbe. I drew hands and feet and eyes. And I said, if you were a person, what would your personality be? You're wily, you're stealth, you're sneaky, you're beautifully rendered, right? Like, what do? You kill and torture slowly. You're kind of like a serial killer, except there's millions of you and you go back generations kind of thing. So that was a monumental undertaking because the book had two narratives. It had the narrative of the race for the cure and the narrative of these nurses. And they had to be braided at some point. And then it was the narrative of the patients. And in the background was the bigger cultural moments, the Great Depression, which fed into tuberculosis, World War II, which not only fed into tuberculosis, but brought us the advent of antibiotics. So that was monumental. The other thing was listening to people's lived experience is is a big task. I am the daughter of immigrants. I'm a first generation immigrant. My family is from Greece. I was used to oral stories. I grew up with them. The Greeks love oral history. So that didn't bother me. It was listening to these really painful parts of it and having to ask about it again and again and again. And that didn't happen right off the bat. I mean, let's say I initially met them and I said, tell me about Missouri. It took time. They wanted took time for them to trust me. Some people just started talking. Some people just went for the like kind of juggler. And that was tough because I remember leaving sometimes from meeting with like Missouri's niece, and I couldn't even transcribe the stuff. I let it sit for a while, and then I went back, and I was like, oh, now I got to go back. And we went together. We went on a 5-day trip to Clinton, South Carolina. She took me on through the woods where Missouri would walk to pick cotton in the morning because she couldn't go through the direct route because it cut through the mill town where the white people lived, and they would stand on their balconies and throw things at the Missouri and whoever else was at the black people going to pick cotton. So that was when, and the other monumental part of that was like collating all of these oral histories and then having to fact check certain things. That when I had decided early on with my editor, we were never going to fact check someone's lived experience. What we had to fact check were the dates of that lived experience. You know what I mean? So Virginia, when you hear her talking, she'll often say, I enjoyed my time there with the children. They were like regular children. But if you hear somebody else talk about it and you read the nurses' logs, that was a harrowing ordeal, but that was her lived experience and it went in the book. And then I also said the log also said this. But the dates, where they came from, when they came, all that was their salaries, all those numbers and all that stuff was fact checked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, you spend a lot of time on the cure part as well, both some of the trials, the preliminary medication that was given. Do you want to talk at all about how the Black nurses helped cure tuberculosis, or is that going to
Yeah.
give away the ending?
No, I could talk about
Okay.
it. So, without giving away the ending of the book, I mean, it says on the title, The Nurses Who Helped Cure Tuberculosis. These women were critical to the clinical trials. They were the first clinical trials for the first drug that would end up curing tuberculosis. It's a drug called isoniazid. It's still the gold standard treatment for tuberculosis that's not multi-resistant tuberculosis, which is a different form of the disease. It meant that tuberculosis is rendered a little bit differently. The way this comes about is the hospital gets a call from a drug company if they wanted to test a drug, this particular drug, and they say, yeah, we do. And the people in the front lines are these nurses. The drug had never been tested on humans, and it's a small set of people. Originally, it started out with 5, and it went to 92. And the nurses were tasked with not only administering the drug, but also watching for side effects. And one of the best stories, I think, that illustrates how meticulous and astute they were in their job is one of the side effects of this medication ended up being a twitching of the legs. The way they found out that they were twitching, the patients, is they saw the legs twitching while they slept. Now, they were sleeping under blankets because most of these people weighed like 70 pounds and they were always cold and the windows were always open. So the ward, as I say, picture this long ward with beds on either side and windows constantly open. So there's a cross breeze because a cross breeze is supposed to clear the wards of the disease. So it was always cold. And the trials were taking place in November, December, January, February. So it was brutally cold up there. And they were able to notice that the legs were twitching. They were able to notice that people were getting a little bit giddy, but they were like, is it giddy because they're feeling better? Or is there like a kind of induced psychosis happening? And at night, Dr. Robichek would come and collate. So their job was to not only do vitals, but look at the emotional state, the mental state. And then they did a scan of the body. And are there bruises happening? Is anything distended? Does anything look off? And they would come at night and take their charts and collate the information. And slowly they started to get like, oh, this is the number one, ringing in the ear was the number one side effect. But that was only because the nurses reported it. So, and he said, his son told me, my dad always said, if it wasn't for these Black nurses, none of this would have been able to happen. And by this meaning, not just the trials, the running of Seaview. He always told his son, I'm not at risk because his wife was worried that he would get sick. And he said, it's not me you have to worry about. It's the nurses. They're the ones who are on the front lines. And he always gave them credit.
Wow. My goodness, I think I could talk to you much longer about,
I know.
about this book.
It's so much fun.
So
I love talking about the book.
Yeah, well, it
Yeah.
was great. I see why. Where can people find out more about you and about the book?
So if you Google my name, I think at this point I've done hundreds of different types of like media and interviews. They can go to my website, mariasmilios.com. You can buy the book at an indie bookstore or on Amazon. I will say, if you buy it on Amazon, please do not buy the paperback. That is not an authorized version of the book. The only authorized version in the United States is the white cover with the picture of the Black nurses. The unauthorized version is blue. And that's only available on Amazon, the unauthorized version. Everywhere else, they just sell the regular book. And then if you go to my website, you can hear some interviews with Virginia Allen. You can hear her talking about what she hopes the legacy will be, that she hopes every nursing school will have the book and that people will read the story. If some of the podcasts, I think, have her too. I don't remember which ones, but if you poke around the website, you can find things that you can hear her too.
Wonderful.
Which is pretty fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much for being on Reading with Rachelle.
Thank you.